The day is in the midst of a year-long look at affordable housing in the region. What specifically do you think the legislature should do to help people who can't afford to buy a house or are struggling to rent an apartment?
Well, there are a lot of things. The whole system of affordable housing under 830G, which is the plan where if a developer that's Connecticut General Statutes 8-30G, if a developer wants to develop affordable housing, what's considered affordable housing under the statute, they have a certain procedure that they can go through. And if they fail to get approved by the local municipality, there is a shortcut that they can take to go to court to get the court to approve their project. One of the big problems is that those projects are typically primarily market rate housing with a few affordable units. So the developers make a fortune on these market rate units, and they put them in places that they really shouldn't be. And they get this incentive that they can build those market rate units so long as they throw in a couple of affordable units. The other big problem is the definition of affordable housing. An affordable housing unit has to have some type of deed restriction. So if I've got a house, let's say I live in a small town, I live in Chaplin. Let's say I have an extra house in Chaplin, and I want to rent it out to somebody who is who doesn't have a lot of money, who can't afford a market rent. So I say, okay, you know what? I'll let you live in this house. I'll give you a lease for $100 a month. Clearly, that is an affordable rent, but that house doesn't count towards the mandated 10% of housing units because I haven't put a deed restriction on that. I believe it's for 25 years. So so that's a disincentive to have affordable units, because it is putting a great burden on the landlord. So we need to change the definition of affordable housing to incentivize people to create units that count as affordable units. Right now, virtually all of the definitions and disincentives in the statutes prevent people from creating affordable units.
Next is Connecticut recently enacted a law designed to provide safeguards against lawsuits for out-of-state patients seeking abortions in Connecticut and any providers who assist them. Do you support the efforts to make Connecticut such a safe haven?
Well, I'm an attorney, and I look at this fight between Connecticut and Texas from a constitutional standpoint. What Texas did, I think, started this fight and started down this slippery slope, which is constitutionally suspect. What Texas did was it essentially passed a law that would extend its what they call a long arm statute, meaning that a person suing civilly in Texas can reach across with a long arm, reach across state lines into another state. And it extended its long arm statute that it could go to any state and sue somebody who essentially left Texas and went to another state to get an abortion. That, I think, started down the slippery slope. What Connecticut did was it steepened the slope and put grease on it and made it even worse. And what it did was it said, if anybody tries to come to Connecticut and do that, they are subject to Connecticut law, and they get to go back to Texas with another suit. And the whole thing is just essentially a pissing match that the courts are going to throw all of these laws out. Now, it's one thing to say Connecticut wants to be a sanctuary for certain things. It's a completely other thing to say that Connecticut has jurisdiction across state lines into other states. Now, admittedly, Texas started this, and they should not have. But Connecticut should not have passed the law they did. There are other ways to do what they tried to do. I was completely against the whole thing. I was against what Texas did, and I was against what Connecticut did, because I think they're both constitutionally suspect, and I think the courts will throw out both of those laws.
So next, the state surplus has grown to over $4 billion. Do you support the decision to use some of that to lower the state pension debt, or do you think more of that should have been returned to the taxpayers?
No, I do agree that it needs to be paid down. We have massive debts in this state. It's easy to say we have a big rainy day fund and we have a big surplus. All of that comes from the 2020, I believe, or 2019 budget. Perhaps your viewers remember that there was a time a few years ago when the Republicans and the Democrats in the Senate had an even split. There was 18 Democrats and 18 Republicans. So the Republicans and the Democrats had to actually talk to each other in order to get anything passed, because it was 18-18. And in the House, the Republicans were only, I think it was 4 or 5 short. So they were much closer than they are today. And in that year, the Republicans actually passed through both chambers our budget. The Democrats' budget went down, the Republicans' budget passed. It was the first time anywhere in the country that a minority party had passed their own budget through both chambers. Now, the governor vetoed that budget, so it didn't get signed into law. But what it did show was that the Republicans had good ideas that brought over a couple of Democrats. And some of those ideas were setting certain caps and mandating that the rainy day fund get funded, mandating that the transportation fund actually get the transportation money that it's supposed to, and prohibiting the Democrats from stealing that money for other pet projects as they had been doing for decades. So the reason why we have the surplus we have now is because of those caps and those protections that were written into the budget that eventually became the budget that passed into law.
How should Connecticut move forward to address climate change with regard to electric vehicles and with electric vehicles, wind power, and other clean energy strategies?
Well, I think that the governor is pushing way too hard, way too fast. I would like to be able to continue to drive a gasoline-powered car. I would like to be able to drive a gasoline-powered tractor. I think that the forcing everybody to go electric when we don't have the capacity or the infrastructure to run everything electric is a fool's errand. Because what it does is it says everybody's going to drive an electric car, even though we can't. if everybody had an electric car today, the grid would collapse. Look what happened in California. In California, they're forcing everybody to drive electric cars, and the governor of California has essentially decreed on his own that I think it's by 2035 all new cars will be electric, and there will be no fossil fuel powered cars anymore in California. The next week after that announcement, they started having blackouts because the electric infrastructure was insufficient to support even what they have now, and they were telling people, don't charge your electric car. Well, that is what would happen here. In fact, because of some very foolish legislation that passed, that the Democrats passed without a single Republican vote, Connecticut is tied right directly to California's emission standards. So when California decrees that there shall no longer be any fossil fuel cars, Connecticut, under Connecticut state law, must do the same thing. And I think it's very foolhardy for us to tie ourselves to any other legislative body. The people of Connecticut should be making their own decisions about what happens in Connecticut. We are very different than California. We have about 3.5 million people in Connecticut. They have over 45 million people in California. It's 20 times the size with more than 10 times the people. It's a very different state. We should be making our own laws and not saying that that we will automatically do whatever California does. What we're doing now is going to be detrimental to the people of this state.
Do you think the 2020 election was conducted fairly and Joe Biden won? Do you support early voting and voting by mail initiatives?
Okay, well, clearly he won. There were a lot of irregularities. There were people, including secretaries of state, who changed voting procedures illegally. But you don't redo an entire nationwide election because there are isolated instances of irregularities. There are irregularities in every election, state, federal, and local. So, clearly Joe Biden won. Joe Biden is the president. I think what we need to do is we need to ensure that we minimize the irregularities. We follow the Constitution and only allow legislatures to change voting laws and not have bureaucrats do it. So we look to the next election and try to make it better. What was the other part? Early voting
and voting by mail.
Well, early voting, I'm okay with to an extent. My general feeling is there should be an election day and not an election month. But for people who have problems getting to the polls on election day, they should certainly be allowed to vote early. One of the big problems is that things happen during the course of the early voting period that would have changed people's votes. That's why there's one day, even when elections were conducted in an age of the horse and carriage, and people had a hard time getting to the polls, they still had one day where everybody had to get out and vote. Now that things are so easy, you can move from one end of the state to another in a couple of hours. We really should try to have an election day. we should make accommodations for people who can't, for one reason or another, if they're out of town, if they're sick, if they're tending to somebody who is disabled, things like that. But I see no reason to stretch an election out over a month. And I have not heard a good explanation from the advocates of election month or even more. I know there are states that are, frankly, already accepting ballots. I'm not. There's a lot of things that are going to happen within the next month or so. A lot of news. One of the candidates might die. Who knows what's going to happen? I think it's best to try to keep it to election day as much as possible with necessary accommodations where needed.
Okay. Last question. The 47th district has a lot of small towns and a piece of Norwich. School funding issues have always been a big question in the annual town budgets, and sorry, my eyes are messed up. In the town budgets, and Norwich is facing a $385 million referendum for school construction. Is there anything that the legislature can do to re-examine and restructure the school funding processes and help towns and to help large and small towns in general to afford school infrastructure and construction?
There's a lot the legislature can do, and I've worked on this for many years with the schools in my area. I have met and I have assembled meetings with superintendents, with boards of ed, and brought them all into a room and asked, what can we do to make things easier? One of the things that drives me crazy is we have all these laws, and the people that those laws affect bitch about them, and you've got legislators who are sitting there saying, well, we've got a problem, let's fix the problem, and they come up with these things out of thin air to fix the problem. They pass them into law, and they don't fix the problem, and the people that those laws affect get even madder. They're like, well, why'd you do that? So what I did was I brought the people who were affected by it into the room. I got superintendents, I got teachers, I got Board of Ed chairs, I got parents, and brought them into the room and asked them, tell me what law you're bouncing up against. Tell me what law is on the books that is preventing you from giving children the best education for the best price. And boy, once you ask them, they tell you. And I had lists and lists of laws and mandates and things that were wrong with the statutes, and went through a lot of that stuff. I spent essentially 2 years meeting every month or so with this group and putting this list together. Now, a lot of the actual work of trying to get those laws changed got kind of tied up in the whole COVID thing. We had to stop meeting. I introduced a bunch of the bills, but they didn't go very far. The Democrats don't seem to want any of those bills to go through for some reason. So I couldn't get them out of committee. But we did get a couple of things through. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in moving this coming year, is there are towns that, especially the small towns, in the small towns, they can't afford some of the mandates. There's a lot of mandates. The state in its infinite wisdom, the legislature decides we are going to say that every school needs to teach X. Okay, well, to teach X, that means you got to hire another teacher. And to hire another teacher, that means you may have to fire a janitor, or you may have to, cut back on mowing the lawn, or you may have to do something else, because those small schools are on really tight budgets. So if different schools around an area can share a teacher that teaches that particular subject, they don't necessarily have to cut back on other things. So one of the bills that I'm pushing this year, and thankfully I've been able to get my side of the aisle to agree that it's an important issue and to push it as a party, is to remove the barriers that prevent towns from sharing services. So, things like a backhoe. Every school district at some point needs a backhoe to dig a hole, to fix something, but they don't need one every day. Most of the time it's just sitting there in the garage. Well, if 2 or 3 schools share that backhoe, each one can be using it when they need it. It can get used, and it isn't just sitting there, and you don't need to buy 3 backhoes. But there are certain statutory prohibitions on sharing services and equipment and things like that, that the people that I've talked to, the superintendents, the boards of ed, they've identified things for me that I'm bringing to the legislature and saying, these are things that in my area, in eastern Connecticut, we need these things changed in order to make the schools more efficient so they can give the best education to the children at a price that the people who live out here can afford.